Just a moment ago, we heard Dennis and Len talk about what does it look like, what does a lean, agile-based system of delivery actually look like, and what is our point of view at Leading Agile. Now what I'd like to spend some time talking to you about is how do we actually get you there? Your organization has made the decision to implement a new system of delivery to get better business outcomes, but actually how do we get there? And I'm sure especially for a lot of us that have been in the industry for a while, we know that the stats on transformation are not great. So picking up on a thread that Mike gave us this morning, we do have a point of view in terms of what does a system of transformation look like? And it's not magical, it's not a silver bullet. There's very defined patterns and frameworks that allow us to get there and also allow us to learn along the journey. So that's what I'd like to explore with you this afternoon. First of all, when we think about creating a roadmap for change in our organization, the first step to creating a roadmap to change isn't about sitting down with pen and paper or getting our executives in a room and actually building out a plan, that kind of big upfront planning. First of all, it really starts with examining our beliefs and what do we actually think about transformation. We see three key patterns. Some organizations approach their transformation as what I would call a culture-focused transformation, and we'll unpack that in just a second. Other organizations take a practices view of their transformation. Other organizations still look at it from a systemic standpoint, and what does it mean to put in place the systems necessary to create the conditions for our new system of delivery to emerge. Let's go back and talk about culture. So the culture-focused transformation takes the point of view that if you really shift people's mindsets, really change hearts and minds, that behaviors will emerge that will allow the system of delivery, the new system of delivery, to emerge as well. What we found through our experience is that in fact is not the case. We can change people's hearts and minds, but at the end of the day, if the organization is not restructured, if we do not fundamentally have an organizational design in place to change those behaviors, that new system of delivery simply won't emerge. And if we do see some changes, how sustainable will they be when our organization just simply isn't structured to support and to reinforce the behaviors that we need to see? So culture is important, but it's not where we want to start. Second point of view on transformation is practices focus. Just want to do a quick poll of the audience. How many people have been in an organization or have heard of an organization that spends a lot of time and money on training and coaching and then wonders why they're not getting the outcomes that Agile promises? Wow, a lot of hands going up in the room. Yeah, I had a CIO that I worked with once and he said to me, I spent $80,000 on training. It wasn't even a big team. Why aren't I agile? Why aren't I getting the best business benefits? And it was kind of sad because he almost whispered in my ear. He was a little bit uncomfortable with that reality. So we believe that in terms of practices, you need more than training and more than coaching. Your teams can do the best stand-up meetings, the best retrospectives, the best everything, Scrum, Kanban, SAFe, whatever flavor you like. But unless the organization is structured to support and reinforce those behaviors, what's actually going to happen is you're going to reveal some of the challenges in your organization. You might get some benefit out of Scrum and Agile practices, but certainly not the business outcomes that you're hoping to get. You're going to fall far short of that. Last, we have our systems-focused transformation. So with a systems-focused transformation, one believes that if we intentionally, consciously put in place the structures and the conditions necessary for the practices and the cultures to emerge, we will get the system of delivery that we're looking for. We're going to get this lean, agile system of delivery that will really allow us to connect the business outcomes and make meaningful progress towards delivering value. So we're going to start with examining our beliefs about what do we think about transformation and what kind of transformation do we want to have. We're going to start with a system-focused transformation because we know that's what it takes to be successful. So now the question is, exactly what do we mean by a system? So we heard Mike talk about it this morning. We've heard several of our speakers talk about it. What is a system of transformation? So we talked about a system of delivery. Dennis and Len gave you that. A system of transformation is a set of patterns and frameworks that we use to move slices of our organization into the new system of delivery. Because we're Agilists, this may be shocking, we don't do Big Bang. We look at the Okay, thank you for those of you who laughed. We're going to take slices of our organization, and we'll talk about exactly how we do that, and we move our organization into the new system of delivery, one slice at a time, testing and learning along the way. In addition to that, and that actually we're going to call our transformation backlog. In addition to that, we put in place some other structure that's going to be fundamental to helping us get to where we want to go on our journey. So let's talk about some of our three things. So I just wanted to spend just a couple seconds differentiating our system of transformation from the system of delivery, because this was a little bit confusing to me at one point. System of delivery is what we want to end up with in terms of how our organization delivers value. Our system of transformation is how we're going to get there. So it really is, if you want to think about it at an organizational level, our container for change. So to begin with, we're going to put in place governance. So we want to build a coalition of leadership. For those of you that have been studying change management for a while, you might have heard of somebody named Cotter. One of the key fundamental success factors in any transformation is having a coalition of leaders that are really going to guide, direct, and steward the change. So we're going to build this coalition of leaders, and this leadership group is going to be responsible for stewarding the change, coming up with the plan, executing the plan, holding the organization accountable for making and meeting their commitments, for incorporating learnings along the journey. Once we actually have two levels of governance as well. We have an executive steering committee that's going to really steer from a strategic perspective. We also have a secondary group, which is called a transformation leadership team, which sits closer to the teams, and it's going to work with the teams on almost a daily basis to help remove impediments. So really creating that guiding coalition of leaders to really steward the change within the organization, and not just stewarding the change, but again, holding the organization accountable. Once we have our governance structure in place, again, in the vein of creating the conditions for change, we're going to talk about the structure. Structure is hugely important. We've heard a lot about structure today. Structure being, how are we going to organize how are we going to really restructure, and how are we going to design our organization around the flow of value? What teams are we going to form? How are those teams going to be formed? Where are those teams today? Where do they need to go? We'll talk about that a little bit more later. So when we talk about structure, it's really thinking about redefining, redesigning our organization and starting to break it down. In defining our roadmap to change, we're moving to a place where, as I said, we're going to be able to start to identify slices of the organization that we can move into the new system of delivery. So starting with, what's our teaming structure look like? Last but not least, very importantly, metrics and tools. So identifying what are the metrics that we're going to use to be able to connect our transformation back to outcomes. Personally, I'm a very data-driven person, and this is one of the things that I love about our approach. It's great to say you did all of this stuff, but show me the value. One of the things I challenge my teams and challenge my clients on is, so what? You did all this great stuff, but what are the outcomes you actually got? How can we actually tell that we're making meaningful progress towards value? So when we talk about metrics as part of our overall system of transformation, and our system of transformation is three fundamental things: our governance, our structure, and our metrics. It's really about what are we going to measure? Making the decision about what we measure. Making decisions about how we're going to really be able to track progress, which means how are we going to baseline. I want to kind of tie this back together because it is a little bit of a closed loop. So we have our governance, who's going to create the strategy, steward the change, remove impediments, hold the organization accountable. We have our structure in place, how we're going to form teams, what teams are going to be formed. We have our metrics, what are we going to measure, how are we going to baseline our organization. From that, as we go through this transformation journey, and it will be a journey, we're going to test along the way. We're going to get the metrics from our transformation, and we're going to feed that back to our governance team, who's going to inspect that. Scrum is empirical process control, right? We inspect and adapt. We're going to collect the metrics as we go through our journey, and our governance structure will be constantly evaluating that data, generating learnings, generating insights, and using that to continuously shape and drive our transformation. So system of transformation, we're going to take a systems-based view of our transformation. Three things: governance, structure, metrics. So now that we've examined our views about transformation, we've got in place our system of transformation, now we're going to start to create a roadmap. So how do we actually move the organization into this new system of delivery? This is interesting. We're going to start with the assumption that one size does not fit all. Not every organization, not every team needs to be as agile as the other. I'm laughing because I remember a story of another organization that I worked with, and worked with a gentleman by the name of Carl, and he described his organization and the executives in his organization as they were in the Agile arms race. Every executive wanted to be more agile than the rest. We want to make sure that we're as agile as we need to be. So before we can create our roadmap for change, we need to first make some decisions about where are we today and where do we need to get to. So I'd like to introduce you to what we like to refer to as our compass model. 4 quadrants. So first of all, looking at in terms of our market. In order to decide where we are today and where do we need to be, I'll use that term, how agile do we need to be to optimize for the flow of value, need to have a deep understanding of both our customer and our markets. Emergence is really looking at from a market perspective, do we actually understand the problem that we're solving? Do we understand the solution? Emergent markets, oftentimes the solution's not known. We need to really test and adapt. Vice versa is the convergent market, where we really truly do understand the solution, what we need to do. We're taking a whole bunch of risk and we're trying to package in terms of time, scope, cost that's going to be applicable to our customer, basically in line with what they're expecting. Convergence is more true of mature markets. Emergence is true of immature markets where we're still really solutioning with the customer, trying to figure out what works. Looking horizontally, we have predictability and adaptability. This is more internally focused. Understanding, and I like to put it this way, what do we want to be when we grow up? As an organization, do we really value being predictable? Saying we're going to make a date and we're going to hit that date. Or do we value being adaptable, being able to change and pivot really quickly internally? And just to use some examples, I specifically currently work with a client who I do a lot of back office, finance, human resources. There are a lot of COTS packages. We probably don't need to be extremely emergent and adaptable. But if you're in a lean startup kind of mode and you really don't know what products or services you're developing, you might want to be in that upper quadrant. So before we can develop our roadmap to change, we first need to understand where are we today, which one of these quadrants we put ourselves in today, and where do we want to be when we're done, or where do we want to be when we grow up, developing a hypothesis towards that. So just some examples of some organizations that might typify each of these quadrants. In our upper left quadrant, we've got ad hoc, low trust. These are organizations that are neither predictable, that are not very predictable, and we're not really quite sure what the solution is either. Then we have organizations that are just starting to become predictable. They've incorporated some lean agile principles, and they're becoming increasingly predictable. Moving over, we've got reduced batch size, so organizations that are starting to develop some level of agile maturity. They're starting to reduce their batch size and they're becoming more agile, so they're able to be more adaptable with the markets. On our upper left, we have the lean startup. So these are organizations that are quite adaptable. They can quickly pivot with the market to take advantage of transient advantage. They're able to quickly put stuff into the market to very quickly test and learn. Is that where you need to be? The importance of this model is we don't want to create lean waste. Sure, we've all heard of lean waste. If you are an organization that does not require a high level of adaptability, continuously to invest will get you, again, more agility than you actually require for what business goals that you're trying to accomplish. So in terms of how does this fit into the roadmap to change? To create our roadmap, we need to understand where are we today, where do we want to go, so we can chart a path to get there without overinvesting. Likewise, we don't want to underinvest. If we underinvest and our teams don't have the level of agility we need, we're also not going to drive the business outcomes and the business impacts we want. And worse than creating waste, we're going to be blocking the delivery of value. So really important to understand what's our starting point and what's our hypothesis. And I'm using that word hypothesis in terms of where we want to get to. Now, along the way, we have some milestone markers. We call these our Basecamp model. So those of you that are familiar with our Basecamp model, you'll probably recognize that. For those of you that are not, I'm going to explain. So with our Basecamp model, each Basecamp has a series of outcomes attached to it. And it allows us to be able to track progress through our transformation. I think it's really important to understand that we don't do transformation for transformation's sake. Transformation is expensive, both in terms of cost, as well as energy and resources of the organization. So we want to have a really clear picture. Again, it's a hypothesis. We'll test and learn along the way of where we want to arrive at. And how do we really mark progress in a meaningful way along that journey? So we have Basecamp 1. Basecamp 1 is the organization starting to incorporate lean agile principles and becoming more predictable. Depending on the organization and the teams, where we need to be, we may progress to Basecamp 2. Basecamp 2 is where the teams are starting to break work down into smaller pieces, so they're not just predictable, but we're increasing throughput through the system so that we can deliver value a lot faster. Basecamp 3 is where we start to break the dependencies in the organization. And here's where we're starting to get into teaming structure. You're only as fast as your slowest dependency. Again, another quick survey, the after lunch survey, get the blood flowing. How many people work in organizations and they have super high performing agile teams, but they can't actually deliver that fast because they're kind of bound up in a ton of organizational dependencies? Yep, seeing quite a few hands go up. So when we get into Basecamp 3, if the organization needs to be able to deliver value to customers faster, we need to start to look at how are we going to break those dependencies? How do we really make those teams truly autonomous so they can deliver the value? When the value is required, they can become more adaptable. Basecamp 4, we start to get into more advanced technical engineering practices, and in addition to that, we start to introduce team-based funding. So the teams become even more autonomous, again, because their funding is dedicated. Last but not least, Basecamp 5 is really functioning in lean startup mode, where we're making investments to learn. We are a truly adaptable, emergent organization. We are investing to learn about what products and what services are going to drive the most value for the organization. So before we sit down and put pen to paper in our organizations and create our roadmap for change, we've established our system of transformation based on governance, structure, and metrics. We understand where we are in terms of these 4 quadrants in our base camps, and we have a hypothesis about where we need to go. So now let's talk about how we get there, our containers for change. So we have expeditions. An expedition is effectively a slice of the organization. But before we talk about slicing our organization, slicing and dicing our organization, let's talk about how we create the team structure. So we start off with thinking about how do we form teams, what teams are we actually going to form, and also what are the relationships between the teams. So at the very bottom of our model, we have the delivery teams. These are our prototypical Scrum teams. These are the craftsmen that are out there delivering products and services every day. We try, even at the beginning, to form teams by minimizing dependencies and getting them as autonomous as we possibly can. If we cannot contain those dependencies within the teams, which most often we can as a starting point, because large organizations have a lot of dependencies, we then create our next level of teams. These are the program teams. The program teams are going to really set the requirements, define the technical strategy, as well as create context and coordination for the program teams. So they're providing assistance to those program teams, again, to really help coordinate and program manage what's going to be delivered by the delivery teams. Last but not least, at the highest level of what we call our N-tier architecture, we have portfolio teams. The portfolio team effectively manages the portfolio. They're the ones that decide what's going to get worked on, what's the organization going to invest in, and equally as importantly, what the organization is not going to invest in. What we choose not to invest in is often as important as what we choose to invest in. They're the ones that are making sure that the system that we're constructing is continuously set up to flow value. So, sitting down to create our roadmap for change, we're going to look at what does our organizational hypothesis look like in terms of our team structure. Once we've established that, now we're going to start slicing and dicing our organization. We're going to choose a section of the organization, pulling all 3 different types of teams. So as you can see, our pilot contains a complete slice of the organization, including our portfolio team, our program team, as well as our delivery teams. Now here we're showing 2 delivery teams, but it could be much more than that, just for illustrative purposes. And that slice of the organization will become our pilot. As I said at the beginning, we're going to be good agilists. We're going to, fail before you scale. Each organization is different. Each organization will have a different transformation journey. So we're going to take our very first slice of the organization in an expedition being defined as multiple different levels of the organization moving towards a base camp simultaneously and together. The team, our pilot organization, is going to first move to base camp 1. So that would be the first iteration. And our pilot would be our first increment. So surprise, surprise, good agilists, we're going to take an incremental, iterative approach to our transformation journey. After having learned, hopefully, a lot along the way, once we get to base camp 1, we're going to collect our learnings, effectively what we would look at from a Scrum perspective as a retrospective, test our hypothesis, and then ask ourselves the question, was our initial base camp hypothesis about where we needed to go, was that correct? If the answer is yes, and we need to continue on to a higher level of base camp, we go to a higher level of base camp. We iterate. We test and learn, and we iterate along the way. We're going to take that first slice of the organization, our initial pilot expedition, and now move them on to base camp 2. When we feel we're ready, and it's going to be different for every organization depending on the constraints of the organization, we're going to then continuously pull in additional slices of the organization, moving them through the Basecamp journey. Each slice of the organization becomes an increment. In fact, the increment of the unit of transformation is really a transformed slice of the organization. So we're going to take our second increment, our second expedition, and we're going to start to move them on their Basecamp journey as well. So as you can see, we now have multiple slices, multiple expeditions running through the organization to their target end state in parallel. And they don't need to be at the same place at the same time. Remember, this is absolutely not big batch waterfall transformation style. We've got our pilot at Basecamp 3, where we have our next slice of the organization at Basecamp 1. And then we're going to continue that journey. We've got our pilot moving on to Basecamp 4. As we're going throughout this journey, we're also going to follow a model, a pattern, and a framework called what we refer to as an outcomes-based plan. So at 30 and 60 and 90-day increments, we're going to conduct an assessment workshop. Each of our base camps contains outcomes, and outcomes are looking at have we actually demonstrated progress towards meaningfully improving the business. As we go throughout this expedition journey, we're going to do 30, 60, 90-day check-ins to measure each of the outcomes in each of the base camps and really verify that we are making progress on that specific expedition journey in order to be able to determine is our transformation on track, or is that transformation not on track, and feeding that information back to our governance structure in order that they can be able to take decisions about how we're continuing to conduct the transformation. It looks like we got some progress here. So as you can see, we've got multiple expeditions running in parallel towards our target base camp, achieving their business outcomes, and of course, we're continuously checking in every 30, 60, and 90 days as part of our transformation system. So when we look at our transformation roadmap, how do we really create a roadmap for change? Dennis and Len talked about the system of delivery. Now we need to get into our system of delivery. And again, picking up on the thread that Mike gave us this morning, how do we really create transformational agility? We know that Big Bang doesn't work. Contextualized to every organization, and making sure that we're taking the organization, and specifically at a team level, to the right level of agility. So first and foremost, we understand that we're not going to lead with culture, we're not going to lead with practices, we're really going to lead with structure. Putting in place the right systems, the right structure to create the conditions for the new system of delivery to emerge. Number two, we know that one size does not fit all. Every organization and every team is going to be unique, both in terms of where they're starting and where they need to get to. And it's a hypothesis. We're going to test and learn along the way. The agility that allows us to do that is taking an iterative and incremental approach. So taking individual slices of the organization, containing all teams, our expeditions, moving them to an initial base camp, reviewing our hypothesis about where they need to be, and continuing to pivot and make change. Thank you very much.